Hello, everyone. Happy Wednesday. Thank you for joining us for today's deep dive series. We've reached the halfway point in our series, so thank you for joining us on this journey. I'm going to start with some administrative notes that we do in every session. If you'd like to answer or ask a question, you can look to the upper right-hand corner of your screen and you'll see a question panel, and that's how you submit a question. And then also a reminder that you will get a copy of the slides and a recording of today's session, and that usually will come within 2 business days. Today's topic is the disclosure provisions of Secure 2.0. As you might remember from our prior sessions, there's over 90 provisions in Secure 2.0, and this is a bit of a grab bag because there's multiple provisions that talk about disclosure and multiple provisions that sort of have an indirect effect on disclosure, and that's what we're going to be covering some of those today. There's 2 disclosure topics that we're specifically not talking about today, and those are because those are specific to pension plan defined benefit plans, and we do have a session totally dedicated to defined benefit plans coming up, and so those will be covered there. But just to give you a heads up, there's a new requirement about the annual funding notice that goes to defined benefit plan participants, and then also new notice requirements if your pension plan offers a limited time option to your participants to take a lump sum distribution. So if those are of interest to you or your employer sponsors a pension plan, be sure to join that session of our deep dive series. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Mr. David Whaley, who will be talking through these disclosure provisions with you. So David, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, thanks so much, Michael. Really appreciate the introduction. Want to take a few moments at the beginning to explain sort of my nature and space with respect to assisting and discussing today these interesting questions pertaining to notices and how we ended up in this modification of system. I won't necessarily say easier system, but modification of system with respect to the delivery of communications, specifically paper or versus electronic communications, but communications to employee participants with respect to retirement plans. This topic is not a new topic that we've run across, but it's something that I've seen throughout my history of practice. And I think that as we go through that sort of history of practice and then apply this to the retirement plan space and the edits and modifications that we're seeing now, I think we can get an understanding of where we are, but not necessarily an understanding of where we're going with respect to these factors. I think that one of the first places I want to start is that my participation inside of the retirement plan community for generally inside of ERISA really does pertain to some work that I do with the American Bar Association and the American Benefits Council. And through those, we have direct conversations with regulators and lobbyists that really talk about the conversations that are going on the Hill, that are going on in the regulatory bodies around these questions of employers pushing to try to get information out to participant employees easier and in a cheaper means on behalf of the employer, making sure that in the opposite sort of tension with respect to participant right groups and sort of individual facing organizations, trying to figure out how to make sure that there's enough information in the hands of employee participants. And then we end up having sort of the nefarious crowd, the lobbyists inside of there, trying to figure out how they can personally generate a little bit of money for themselves, right? So as we talk through that, in this tension that has been around these issues, we've seen a lot of modifications over time. And I think we start with, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but we start with this idea of electronic delivery and electronic disclosure and the desire to move to an electronic delivery disclosure space. And the Department of Labor's guidance, the Department of Labor's action with respect to moving to an electronic delivery space, really starting at the turn of the century in about 2002. And beginning this moment of, wait a minute, should we try to figure out how to get information out electronically to employees? And if we get information out electronically to employees, should we send more or less information to those employees because it is electronic? The intrigue of that is that about the same time that the Department of Labor really began that conversation of seeing what information could be pushed out to employees electronically, and honestly, really sort of seeing a world in which we increased the amount of information, but allowed it to be a little bit less paper killing, a little less tree killing to be delivered to participants. We saw some social science around the questions pertaining to basically over-informing individuals. There was a book that I read at the time that I thought was really interesting called The Paradox of Choice. And the paradox of choice actually starts with the author discussing walking into a jean store that had about 150 to 200 different brand types of jean cuts. And the author ended up spending about 30 to 45 minutes, as I remember, trying on different pairs of jeans, trying to figure out what different pair of jeans would work best. Ended up purchasing 2 pairs and felt much, much worse about himself than whenever he walked into a Levi Strauss store 20 years prior and had the ability to choose between 2 pair of jeans and chose 1. So you see, with respect to that conversation on the paradox of choice, what we really got to the place in understanding was that when we over-inform individuals, when we over-choice individuals, we really end up with a participant that either becomes paralyzed or less happy with respect to their decisions. And so we start with this means of pushing out information electronically to individuals. Then we start with some social science that begins to come back and say, you know what, maybe some of the social science is that we're pushing a little bit too much information to people. And we don't want to necessarily push all that information to people because it'll be easier, better if we end up trying to sort of figure out a world in which we can communicate what is happening inside of the plan with fewer words. Which really sort of got us to the Affordable Care Act question. And the Affordable Care Act gave us this SBC, the Summary of Benefits Coverage idea. And it said, hey, you should be able to explain your health plan in 4 double-sided pages with I think it's no smaller than 10-point font. Now, I've seen a lot of information stuffed into the SBCs. I've seen those boxes filled awful full with information, but the thought was, if I could, as a participant inside of that welfare plan, I realize we're talking about retirement plans today, but the same concepts. If I, as a participant with respect to that welfare plan, can be able to compare plan A to plan B from a spousal perspective, maybe to plan C with respect to what is available inside of the marketplace, why can't I provide just a 4-page document that actually provides enough information to employees with respect to retirement plans to accomplish the same? The challenge with that is I think most of you on this webinar will know and understand is that doesn't account for a QDIA notice. That doesn't account for a safe harbor notice. That doesn't account for a 402F rollover notice. That doesn't account for a participant election notice with respect to how much money I want to defer. It doesn't account for a fund performance notice of how my account is or my retirement benefit is otherwise doing. So we have this idea of less information may be better, but we have a lot of laws that tell us that we have a lot of information we have to put out. So we end up seeing this tension between employers trying to reduce the burden, both in the amount of information and the way in which they have to deliver that information. And we have some crowds, let's use the AARP as an example, really pushing for making sure that participant education is more voluminous, but not only more voluminous, but also make sure that it's in a paper format at some level. Making sure not only there's an ability of a participant to raise their hand, but also an ability of some individuals, if not all, to be able to literally say, I need that in paper. And the baseline should be in paper. Then we end up with respect to lobbyists on both sides. And the lobbyists on both sides cannot get to a space or otherwise a solution that doesn't seem to account for the special interest groups, because the arguments with respect to the social science versus the arguments of employers trying to figure out how to lower their burden to be able to carry the water of delivering a retirement system, and the arguments with respect to, frankly, just some of the self-interest of wanting to make sure that paper gets mailed, sort of 2 separate groups there, right? Printing paper and also mailing paper are accounted for. And so those disclosure tensions really drive us to an area where we have Secure 2.0 trying to tackle and take on different parts and parcels of the means in which these notices are to be delivered, and really ending up in a space that almost, as we look at it, is a step backwards. And we look at it as a step backwards because we did get some movement from the Department of Labor with respect to some of these communications and means that we thought was good, that we thought was maybe a little bit better, a little bit less paper, a little bit easier electronic means to deliver. And now we're going backwards in the sense that we have some worlds and some rules that we're going to have to literally deliver paper notices to individuals, at least on an annual basis, for defined contribution plans. And we're going to have a world in which we accomplish that, and maybe even a couple standards of deciding whether or not the delivery of that communication is in paper for one form, but electronically in a different or another allowed form. So realize that as we go through this and we have those tensions, if there's some thought or concern that these don't seem to line up with the same goals, I think you're probably correct that they don't necessarily line up with the same goals. And as we do that, I think it's really important to realize as well, and I know those that have participated with respect to this this presentation set, this webinar set before, have heard, Secure 2.0 really was a Christmas tree with respect to retirement plan ideas. I think it's 92 separate ideas inside of this. And so some of these ideas weren't necessarily as conjoined with respect to a singular goal as you might desire or hope, which means, unfortunately, we have a little bit of a divergent position in the way in which we're delivering those rules. And some of those delivery of those rules are going to conflict with the way in which the other rules are leaning or showing. We're going to end with respect to some conversations that Secure 2.0 requires some of our regulators and other individuals inside the government to evaluate or monitor the means in which some of these notices and these communications are being undertaken. So hopefully, when the next time that there is, if we want to call it Secure 3.0 at some point in the future, the next Christmas tree bill that arrives, there is some coordination communication pertaining to what the goals of communication to participant employees is. So let's move into Secure 2.0. After that soliloquy, let's move into Secure 2.0 and the guidance that we are going to have to comply with as plan sponsors of retirement plan benefits. And the first of those are actually communications to unenrolled participants. Now, it's really an interesting conclusion that we have this spacing of unenrolled participants, right? We've always dealt with this world in which if you're a participant, regardless of whether you're having an account balance or not, you are a participant in the plan and you count for all participant purposes with respect to the plan. We're beginning to see a shift and a movement from that. And the good news with respect to that shift in that movement is that basically we're more and more allowed to treat those people who are eligible but not actually in. They have not created or contributed enough to their plan to actually, or anything to the plan, to actually really be a participant. They don't have an account. And since they don't have an account, there's a thought of let's be able to treat the plan as if they're not really there, and make sure that we can move forward in a way that we have to tell them about the plan, but other than telling them about the plan, we're able to monitor, move forward with respect to the plan in a way that is easier and it actually does not account for them. And what it basically says is, hey, an unenrolled participant doesn't have to get all the notices that you're going to send. An unenrolled participant doesn't have to be communicated the same way that an enrolled participant with an account balance is. But they are going to have to get an annual notice of eligibility. You're going to have to send them this notice annually to tell them, you participant are able to get into this plan. And if you choose to, and this is how you choose to be able to get into this plan. So the biggest factor here really becomes a question of who is an unenrolled participant. So first, they're eligible to participate in the plan, right? They've satisfied all the eligibility criteria with respect to the plan. Second, they've been provided the plan summary, plan description, and all those other notices that are required in connection with initial eligibility. And that's important to think about those other notices that are required in connection with initial eligibility, depending on whether or not you have an automatic enrollment feature, depending on whether or not there's a need for the QDIA notice for default investments. Any of those factors and communications that you need with respect to being able to start in the plan, you've had to be able to provide those to them. And the individual's not participating in the plan. Now, here's the bigger catch with respect to the individuals not participating in the plan. It means that realistically means they don't have an account balance. Well, that means you're talking about a 401k deferral feature plan generally. Now, maybe that 401k deferral feature plan has a matching element, and so that the participant does not contribute, they end up with no account balance. But if you have a 401k plan that actually has a profit sharing element, and this individual employee is going to, or participant is going to get a profit sharing contribution, they're going to be able to, and they will have an account within the plan. And since they will have an account within the plan, they really do lose that position of being an unenrolled participant. So we really are talking about just K deferral only plans or K deferral only with matching contributions for people who have not contributed. And we have this class of people that basically are saying you have the ability to defer, you've chosen not to defer, you have no account, and therefore we're going to send you a notice once a year that says you've got the right to get in, but you've not chosen to get in, so we don't need to communicate with you anymore other than sending you this notice. Now, the intrigue of how this unenrolled participant notice is really going to end up playing with some other provisions of not only secure, but some predecessors to secure with respect to those plans that are automatic enrollment feature plans. And the reason why I say that is that we have some provisions that are covered in some of the other webinars that were covered inside of this series, detailing the need for new plans to actually have an automatic enrollment feature. Well, what's an automatic enrollment feature? It says that a participant, even if they don't affirmatively elect, is going to have money sent to the plan. Well, what if they have money sent to the plan? What did we do? We ended up creating a person or a participant that is an unenrolled, no longer an unenrolled participant. And they have a very, very minor amount of cash that's within the plan if they end up turning that amount off. So we really want to watch if we're going to take advantage as an employer of this unenrolled participant requirement, basically the inability or non-need to communicate to a crowd of people. And it's going to be beneficial to us as an employer to do such, because we will save money with respect to the need to be able to communicate to these individuals. We don't have to maintain account statements with respect to them. We don't have to provide them logons necessarily, even for some of the information that they're able to get to. We're going to need to make sure that we design our plans in a way that actually meets the ability to make sure that they don't get a $3.50 account balance from a deferral to a plan through an automatic contribution arrangement and turn it off. So we need to think about these means in a way that actually accomplishes that goal. The secondary thing with respect to the accomplishment of that goal is, again, that employer profit sharing or employer non-elective contribution will, whenever that account is established, will vitiate the ability of this person to be treated as an unenrolled participant. Now, what do we need to provide to these unenrolled participants? We have to communicate with them annually pertaining to their eligibility. And what we can see with respect to their communication annually on the eligibility, it must have an annual reminder notice must be sent within a reasonable period before the beginning of each plan year, basically in connection with an annual open season election period if there's one. The annual notice should inform the unenrolled participant that they're eligible to participate in the retirement plan. It should provide some key benefits and rights into the plan, and that also must be included on the annual notice. So focusing on, is there a matching contribution? What are the vesting provisions? We're thinking of this a lot, like a mini safe harbor notice for plans that have a safe harbor feature. Now, catch with respect to the safe harbor feature is interesting because the means in which a plan satisfies its safe harbor feature may very well then mean that you are automatically out of having unenrolled participants. Safe harbor plans that provide non-elective contributions, referred as QNEX, qualified non-elective contributions in the safe harbor feature, are going to have, again, that non-elective contribution that will create an account for everybody that's eligible, and therefore you're going to have no unenrolled participants. But for those safe harbor plans that only have the match that is provided in connection with the safe harbor benefit and the match that they are providing in connection with the safe harbor benefit in that deferral, we may end up having some individual plans that are safe harbors that will end up meeting the standard with the safe harbor notice. So we're really seeing the coexistence of the way that those communications are structured, maybe being very similar, if not identical in some instances for these notice to unenrolled participants. Now, what's the question with respect to when this one starts? Well, it started already, right? It's effective for plan years beginning on or after January 1, 2023. So generally, this is effective currently. Again, it's an administrative benefit for employers. So it's one that if you choose to take advantage of, you don't have to communicate as much to these participants. Really, we end up seeing this pop up a little bit more now than we have before. Summary of material modifications for changes in plans resulting from Secure 2.0, resulting from Secure 1.0, resulting from the CARES Act. Don't need to be communicated to these individuals. They just need to get their one-time or their once annual notice saying, hey, if you want to end the plan, you can get in the plan. So a little bit of a benefit here to employers being able to potentially carve up some of their population, but again, very, very plan specific pertaining to who is inside of this crowd of individuals who can be basically excluded from communication. So after that, let's move to the next spacing with respect to conversations on the move. Or are there some questions, Michael?
There is a question actually. So somebody said, I don't have a safe harbor plan. Do you have any recommendations as to what a reasonable period would be?
Yeah, we are really borrowing hard from the safe harbor space, and realize a safe harbor notice needs to be provided generally between 90 and 30 days prior to the beginning of a plan year. We're thinking of that it's going to end up being in the same reasonable space. Now, the question becomes, as opposed to a safe harbor notice, if this notice ends up going out on, December 5th versus December 1st, I don't think we're in trouble or a problem, but I would not be providing this to employees in the last week of December for a January 1 plan year. What our benefit is with respect to that conclusion, though, and I think this is important, is that as we look at this, unless we are very, very staid with respect to our ability to allow people into a plan for deferral purposes, meaning that we only let them in once a year, once a quarter. If somebody doesn't get this notice and enrolls on January 7th as opposed to January 1st, it's not as if they had a massive material harm. They ended up missing the deferral right with respect to one payroll that generally can be made whole by them deferring a little bit more. But we're seeing this as a thought of being provided at the end of November, beginning of December with respect to a calendar year.
Okay. And then just one clarification question. The person submitted was, it sounds like this is specific to defined contribution plans. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is. I mean, and it's specific to defined contribution plans really for two philosophical reasons, right? First of all, it's literally in the code, the guidance that was given, that it is for defined contribution plans, but it's there because when you think about it, it's challenging to have an unenrolled participant with respect to a defined benefit plan. The rationale with respect to defined benefit plans are, in almost all instances, non-contributory. And so the nature of that is that a participant does not get the ability to elect in or out of a defined benefit plan, and it is not their money. So those defined benefit plans end up being very, very similar to profit sharing plans. And since they're very similar to profit sharing plans, the individuals would not meet the standard of being an unenrolled participant. So if we want to move on, we'll move on. Oh, let's go ahead.
One just came in right now. It says, if a plan only has a QDIA or 404A-5 notice requirement, so you might want to explain that for the audience what those are, would this notice be required, or is it simpler to send the existing notices?
Oh, so that's an interesting question. So this is not a required notice. This is a notice that you're sending if you are desiring to get out of providing these individuals other notices. So if you're in a space that you have a very limited notice set with respect to employees, and honestly, or if you have a very, very limited set of employees who are unenrolled participants, the ease with respect to this is that you can go ahead and just continue to communicate with your participants all the information that they would otherwise be entitled to. This is an exception to the crowd of notices, pardon me, this is an exception to the notice requirements of complying you otherwise would have to comply with of sending information out to employees. It's really sort of drives the question, if I've built a system that actually provides all of this information underneath the DOL's new guidance with respect to the ability to be able to communicate to employees information, and it's going to be easier to just push that out to all the people that are eligible with respect to the plan, then why would I want to go through this world in which I'm sending an unenrolled notice saying you're not going to get other information, but if you start enrolling, you will get other information? The real answer, and the reason why we would, I think why we see this, and again, new law, new guidance, new operations, is for a plan that somehow potentially has a per employee, or pardon me, a per participant per year or per month charge. And that per participant per month charge is driven off whether or not an individual has access to be able to get that information, those notices, and is not based upon whether or not a participant has the ability to make an election. And in that instance, we can actually decrease the cost of maintaining the plan by actually removing this crowd of people from the census with respect to getting into the plan. And if we remove them from the census of that nature, we can save some money. Now, how often is that? That's probably an unusual contract with respect to a record keeper, that you're not paying for individuals who have the ability to elect but don't elect in. but you are paying it, they have the ability to get to log in and get information from the platform. So if your payment system's set up based upon logins, and logins don't determine deferrals, two really interesting sort of chains, then maybe this ends up saving you money. Otherwise, it may very well be a notice set that really is not going to be beneficial to anybody, because it's going to be cheaper, easier, better to just go ahead and provide the information to all the employees, because your set of people who are, quote, unenrolled participants is minor, and the fact that you would have this notice does not save you any money. So just going ahead and providing the information ends up being a better world of not needing to show that we didn't provide them this information.
All right, David, got another question that rolled in. We didn't know this one would be such a question topic. So this one says, do the annual reminder notices apply to safe harbor plans that have a profit sharing feature that is not activated?
So essentially what we're thinking is that this is a profit sharing, and I'm going to restate what I think the question is that basically currently individuals are only able to make a 401k deferral. They are able to receive a safe harbor matching contribution with respect to that plan. And there is a employer non-elective provision within the plan, but it's either discretionary and not used, or has sunset such that there is a freeze date with respect to the contributions that would go in. The intrigue is that, and so this is one of those spaces that I think is really interesting. I read the code as saying that that person, pardon me, would still be an unenrolled participant because they do not have an account within the plan. They have not chosen to make a deferral to the plan, and since they don't have an account within the plan and not chosen to make a deferral to the plan, they would meet that definition of an unenrolled participant. There have been some commenters and some comments that have been provided inside the community that says, if you are eligible to receive a non-elective contribution, you cannot be an unenrolled participant. Now, I don't see that inside of the law. I understand the rationale behind it, because it's aimed at if you don't have an account. But that'll be in a space that if we do get guidance, again, I don't anticipate this being high on the guidance priority list for Treasury or the IRS, but I could be incorrect on that. That it really becomes this question of trying to figure out, hey, how do I dive through that? Now, here's where the real answer to me comes, though. If you have a safe harbor plan, that safe harbor notice is largely going to comply, if not actually comply, with the notice of the eligibility to unenrolled participants. And so the real question becomes, I'm going to send that safe harbor notice out. I'm basically not going to send out all the other notices I have to annually potentially provide to that individual. But that individual can get those notices by being able to put some money in the plan. I don't see a ton of harm in treating that safe harbor notice as my notice of annual notice of eligibility, and also not treating those individuals as able or needing to get all the other notices, because those other notices really do pertain to their ability to be able to, what their rights are with respect to the accounts that are in there. That being said, there are some people commenting that those individuals that have access to a profit sharing account but have not had any money placed in that profit sharing account don't meet the definition of an unenrolled participant.
Thanks, David. Looks like we're good to move to the next topic.
Yeah. So the next, required paper statements. And so this is one that we've had a bigger conversation around inside of the nature of what we're looking at, what we're needing for in connection with basically communicating to participants. And this was one of those spots that we really saw some of the participant focused trade associations and lobbyists really, I'm going to say, win with respect to what is necessary to be provided to participants in plans. And what's gotten to us said is that, hey, ERISA is going to require defined contribution plans with participant-directed investments to provide benefit statements at least once each calendar quarter, right? Defined contribution plans without participant-directed investments must provide benefit statements at least once each calendar year. And defined benefit plans must provide statements at least once every 3 years. And we're going to have to provide these in paper unless the participant, and if we go to the next slide, I think this is really what's interesting, unless the participant complies with the old 2002 Department of Labor regulations on communications, electronic communications. Now, an interesting point here with respect to the new Department of Labor guidance pertaining to electronic communications and the need to be able to say, no, we're going to push back and say, pardon me, let me go back to this, I apologize. Secure 2.0 amends ERISA to say that defined contribution plans must provide at least one benefit statement in paper each calendar quarter. And defined benefit plans must have one every 3 years, right? So we're in a space that we're gonna have to send some paper. The interesting part with respect that we have to send the paper to people though is that we can't lean into the DOL's new guidance. They've really told us and hamstrung us that we're gonna have to comply with the 2002 standard of what the delivery of participant statements was. Now, if we skip ahead a slide, and I think that this is important to go through for a second, the old DOL rules. The old DOL rules, the 2002 rules said that participants who can effectively access documents at any place where they're reasonably expected to perform duties as an employee, and they have access to electronic information as an integral part of their job, are deemed to have access to be able to get stuff electronically. Or those people who affirmatively consent are able to get these notices, are able to be able to get stuff electronically. So really sort of an interesting space. And we moved that guidance, and this is not about the 2020 guidance from the Department of Labor, but that theory has moved forward in some recent guidance from the Department of Labor that basically said, no, we're going to move this. We're going to take some ability of moving these communications off of a paper world into an electronic world easier. And the Department of Labor, pardon me, the Secure 2.0 backed that up and said, no, we want some paper out there. Now, why? Because lobbyists and trade groups pushed to make sure that there was that once annual for defined contribution, once every 3 years for defined benefit plans, communication to employees in paper, unless they meet that standard of, hey, you work at a desk and you're able to get the paper at work, or you affirmatively consent. Two interesting parts with respect to the 2002 reg I think that we need to revisit is first, a kiosk generally does not work with respect to electronic delivery because those people that have kiosks do not have access to electronic information systems as an integral part of their jobs. And so I think that the kiosk element is important. The second is this consent element. And the consent element we'll cover in a minute. It becomes a little bit different under another portion of Secure 2.0 that really requires us to actually have paper consent to the delivery of these notices. The really important thing, I think, is that the 2002 guidance from the Department of Labor was deemed a safe harbor. It was deemed a means of you, employer, are deemed to comply with this safe harbor, the communication structure of the safe harbor, if you comply with these regs. Well, if you remember in sort of the soliloquy I started with, we ended up having summary of benefits coverages, SBCs, that were delivered to employees with respect to welfare plans. And interestingly, at the time that the guidance pertaining to SBCs came out, the Department of Labor said, you know what, we're going to let you postcard those SBCs. And I'll explain what postcarding is, but if we're going to let you postcard those SBCs, then that'll be reasonable enough compliance. What postcarding meant was, well, we talked about the SBCs, they're 4 double-sided pages. So if you want to go single, it's 8 pages, and you have to mail that to everybody. If you're going to have to mail that to potentially everybody, and there's a question of even mailing it to some, members who are spouses or children at home, goodness, we have a lot of paper. And so what the Department of Labor let us do with respect to the SBCs was send a postcard or a letter to people's homes saying, hey, there's a really important document. It's called a summary of benefits coverage. And you're going to be able to log into this website. You're going to be able to contact this person in HR, and you can get a copy of that SBC. So we don't have to mail it to you. We're going to end up postcarding you about where you can get it. And the Department of Labor told us you can postcard SBCs. The really interesting element then became a lot of us, I will be among them, that began to advise our clients. The 2002 guidance from the Department of Labor pertaining to safe harbor is a safe harbor alone. It is not the only means of complying with the electronic delivery of communications to employees. And since it's not the only means, because the Department of Labor specifically told us we can postcard SBCs, and aren't SBCs more important than almost any of our other notices, if you think about it? They pertain to what health plan coverage we have, to be able to help us choose what health plans we will have for the next year. Shouldn't our communications pertaining to retirement plans be able to be on a postcard? So we can tell people at home, go to this website. And if you go to that website, the information is going to be there. And so we had a lot of the industry had moved beyond the 2002 regulations and the 2002 safe harbor by saying that's a safe harbor. That's not the only way to comply. And since that's a safe harbor, that's not the only way to comply. You can comply by postcarding those notices. Now we're taking a little step backwards. And the reason we're taking a little step backwards is because the Secure 2.0 specifically referenced in compliance with that safe harbor as a means to deliver these required paper statements. And so what it really then means is that participants, we're going to be locked in for the safe harbor electronic for this annual paper notice to participants who can effectively access documents at any place they're reasonably expected to perform services and duties as an employee, and they have electronic systems as a part of their job. It means factory floor workers are not going to meet inside of that world. And so if we have factory floor workers that generally aren't going to be able to meet inside of those worlds, or field workers in construction sites that can't generally meet inside of those worlds, we're going to either have to provide this paper for a defined contribution plan once a year, 3 for defined benefit plans every 3 years, or we're going to have to then lean into the second. Individuals entitled to documents have affirmatively consented to receive documents in a manner that's reasonably demonstrates their ability to access electronic information. But then there's even a further catch, because inside of that provision of secure, after December 31, 2025, plan sponsors are going to have to be required to provide a one-time initial paper notice of the right to request all documents be furnished in a paper. So you're going to have to provide paper to have people consent that they don't want paper. There's a lot of, we're going to call it a paper chase for those people that have seen, I think, the 1978 movie of the same title, with respect to the ability or need to be able to get out of providing this once annual notice to defined contribution participants. I'm not positive what the market is going to shake out with respect to this. But I can see, especially with respect to a statement that's largely a piece or 2 pieces of paper, let's hope, about what your statements inside of a defined contribution plan are, that only needs to be provided once a year, we may end up mailing that. And we may end up, and if we're going to do an annual mailing, maybe we're for a safe harbor plan where we decide we're going to do an annual mailing of the safe harbor notice too. And then we're going to start to see about maybe I just go ahead and do an annual mailing with respect to some of the other things I need as well, because then I can demonstrate I actually mailed it to their house. I don't know how this is going to shake out. I think that the interesting question with respect to this is going to be how easy it's going to for all of us to get comfortable that individuals have affirmatively consented to receive documents in a manner, in an electronic manner, and to do such after that 2025 date in a means that actually is probably signed on paper. To be able to deliver. So I think that that's really an important spot as we look at this in the future. Yeah, we're going to have to comply with, and we're going to have to comply. This begins for effective for plan years January 1, 2026. So it's a bit down the road. But as we sort of look at this, we're going to have to pay a lot of attention to the way that we're monitoring and paying attention to these notices and the requirement for paper notices, because as we look at and sort of monitor and move forward with respect to these requirement for paper notices, it's going to be necessary for us to think about, maybe it's just easier for us to mail once a year. And if we can find a way to mail once a year most of it and postcard the rest of it in that mailing, we may end up demonstrating our compliance with the law in a lot easier means. Michael, anybody have any thoughts or questions pertaining to that?
Yeah, you made some people nervous, and it's a little off topic, but I think there's probably other people that are nervous since we got multiple people submitting it. But basically what it boils down to is they said that they use postcarding for like distribution of their SPDs, and I just want to make sure, like, are you saying that no notices can be provided with postcarding, or this is specific to this particular requirement?
This is specific to this particular requirement, which I really, and this is the thing that's interesting, I really dislike that conclusion, because it means that now when the question becomes from employers, just like we got already, there's going to be a confusion. Because the question is, can I provide this electronically? Well, you can provide most things electronically, but this once a year notice for a defined contribution plan, you can maybe provide electronically. So I think what we're going to end up seeing is postcarding, and interestingly, we're seeing more postcarding underneath the Department of Labor's guidance move to even texting. So little text links to individuals' phones, as I think that most of us are a little bit better about catching our texts than our emails anymore. And so the idea of postcarding, the idea of we move to text links with respect to these documentations, we're fine for everything else. We fit within the DOL's guidance for everything else. It's this one special notice. Now, good news, this one special notice is down the road a bit, but we're going to have to watch the marketplace with respect to that. And unfortunately, we're all going to have to pay attention to the conclusion that they're going to end up being multiple standards of who's allowed to send what electronically, because we now have at least 2 buckets. And that doesn't even count the welfare side, where we start adding other buckets.
Okay, and then another one here. Can the 2020 DOL notice of internet availability letter be used as the affirmative consent?
So interesting, by the time this becomes out, I don't believe so, because the affirmative consent is going to end up needing to, this is going to be some guidance. We do think there will have to be guidance written on this part. That the affirmative consent, I think, is going to have to be paper in front of them, and it's not just a notice of availability. It will be super, and as we talk about some of the things later that have been charged to Treasury, to the Department of Labor, to some other congressional offices, it may be interesting to see what their guidance that they're required to come out with will modify some of those conclusions. But we're going to end up seeing a lot of conversation. Now, one of the things I think that's important as we see this conversation is that first slide. We all think as employers, shouldn't we be able to go to electronic? It's easier, cheaper, better. But there are some constituencies that are really pushing hard against the conclusion that getting rid of paper is cheaper, easier, better. And so there are going to be some powerful forces that are lobbying not only the regulators, but also congressional members that will discern or fight against the conclusion that electronic is better.
Okay, and then you mentioned that we do expect guidance. The question was, do we think a model notice is going to be provided?
I would be floored that we would get a model notice. I do not believe it.
Okay.
I could be wrong.
Okay. And then lastly, the question is, will this be a one-time consent that you need to obtain, or is there kind of a continuing obligation to renew it?
We think it's a one-time consent, and so as a part of that, if it's paper and it's a one-time consent, I've seen some people write about it, and I think this is not a bad idea. This is a welcome packet information. This is the same time that you're filling out all your immigration paperwork, all your W-4 paperwork, right? I mean, this is the same time that we want to make sure that we're getting, hey, here's your notice. Wait, don't you want to get your retirement plan notices electronically? Please sign this.
Given timing, I think let's jump to the next topic.
Yeah, no, we've had a more robust conversation than I ever anticipated we would with respect to notices. But on the next topic, sort of getting to we're getting to the spaces of starting to have some conversations around modifications that have been requested from Congress to the regulators. And so Secure 2.0 directs Treasury to issue model forms that can be used for retirement plans to process receipt and distribution of eligible rollover distributions. Now, what's really important here is this is not the 402F notice. Remember, the 402F notice is the notice that is given to participants whenever they are eligible to take a distribution, explaining to them the ways and the tools that those participants can keep that money tax preferred. And it's really the notice that tries to tell people it's silly to take out your retirement before retirement because you're going to pay a lot of taxes, right? And so it tells you, send it to a 401k, send it to an IRA, try to leave it in this plan. And so that notice is a different notice than what we're talking about here. This is really a form that's really designed to actually be the election form. So trying to give us space and information on an election form. Now, interestingly, as part of the ABA, there was a conversation with Treasury and the IRS pertaining to about this topic at the May meeting. And the conversation pertaining to this topic, it really ended up showing the wealth and different amount of information that are on these distribution election forms as compared across the spectrum. Not only from record keeper to record keeper, but also from plan type to plan type to document provider to document provider. And so there were some thoughts with respect to potential opportunities to simplify, shorten, or just honestly make more uniform the form. Hey, do we want separate forms for direct and indirect rollovers? Or do we want those all in the same form? Do we want a default investment option and instructions to make an election versus an installment information on the forms, right? Do we want to utilize processes for automatic rollovers or auto portability on side of those forms? Do we have people consent in or communicate that there's going to be such provisions? And honestly, do we want to allow or encourage inclusion of a benefit statement or on a 402F notice? Do we want to just build this into something else, right? So it'll be super interesting to see where Treasury ends up with this. They do have a requirement to actually provide this information to the marketplace by January 1, 2025. So I know that it is on their priority guidance plan. I know that it is a matter of something that they are working on earlier in Secure 2.0 than later, and there will have to be guidance with respect to this.
And then just a shout out on auto portability, that we will actually be covering that topic in depth in one of our future series. So if that's something you want to learn about or unfamiliar with, be sure to tune into that.
Yeah. So let's move on to the next, hardship self-certification, something that we really do see some conversations from our employers about. Let's talk a little bit about the history of proof of hardship, right? So pre-2015, we really were in a world where we had self-allowed self-certification from record keepers, plan record keepers of hardship. We basically took people's word at it, right? We were like, yeah, if you certify and we'll kind of think about it, maybe you would not ask and you can get running. In 2015, the IRS issued a newsletter indicating that employers should ask for and keep physical proof of the need for hardship withdrawals, such as medical bills. So it wasn't just going from functionally self-certification of, yeah, I got that as an employee, as an employee participant, but also saying, not only do you have to say you have that employee participant, we need to see it, we need to keep it as the plan administrator. And that caused a lot of rankling inside of the world of plan administration, which led to the 2017 memorandum to the IRS agents for allowing a summary of the information and not the direct source materials. So if you think about it, inside of the record keeping system, it was a note box that said plan administrator reviewed a bill for medical expenses in the amount of close to $100,000, thus demonstrating the hardship of the participant employee. So we have an interesting history on the proof of hardship, from almost self-certification, if not entirely in some cases, to the IRS auditing, then moving into saying, no, you plan administrator need the actual documents or copies of the actual documents, to then some summaries of the documents was allowed. And we get into a legislative solution. You know, the employers now may rely on participants' self-certification in determining that a hardship is on account of an immediate heavy financial need, not in excess of the amount necessary to satisfy the need, and not able to be avoided by alternative means of paying the participant. We're allowed to rely on the participant. Now, we're allowed to rely on the participant so long as we don't have direct knowledge that the participant's really lying to us about the hardship. Now, truth be told, I think it's very, very challenging to have direct knowledge that a participant is lying about the hardship whenever we're in a space that oftentimes these are being handled by record keepers and service providers that are not inside the company. We don't think that there's a ton of audit or risk with respect to these self-certifications unless people are purposefully and particularly playing a game to say that something is a hardship to be able to continue to get money out of a plan. And so if there is a risk with respect to this and we think that we have knowledge of a non-hardship, it really will be in the space where a retirement contribution will go into a plan and 80% of the employee's population ends up taking it out as a hardship every year. Those type of scenarios are the type of scenarios that we end up getting to the spot of having a regulatory risk. But the one-offs, the ability of people to have a hardship distribution on account of their own, I'm not real concerned with respect to plan sponsors indicating or saying that they have actual knowledge or having an audit risk with respect to a claim that a participant had or a plan sponsor had actual knowledge that there was not a hardship. But realize there is that anti-abuse rule inside of the rule that says you plan sponsor, if you have actual knowledge it's not a hardship, then you can't allow the distribution. There is some ability of Treasury with respect to they may issue regulations that would permit a plan administrators, if they have actual knowledge again, they may issue those regulations. And ease of administration, right? So this change makes it easier for participants to request distributions. Participants no longer have to produce the documentation, and plan administrators no longer have to confirm. It's fantastic. This is eligible, right? Effective for plan years beginning on or after December 21, 2022. So we're living in a world in which we can have this hardship self-certification, which is great with respect to plan administrations for those that choose to have hardship distributions within their plan. That's a different conversation for a different day about whether or not you should or should desire to have that, though. Michael, let's move into sort of the final space here as we are beginning to wind down with respect to this webinar. We ended up in some spots that Congress told regulators that they need to do some things. And what it really was is Congress ended up in a space of dealing with this Christmas tree, but not necessarily enough social science information, even from the think tanks in the world and the lobbyists in the world, to be able to make sure that they were comfortable advising or needing the changes that were necessary. So Secure directs the Secretaries of Labor and Treasury to adopt regulations providing that defined contributions plans may consolidate 2 or more notices. So let's talk about a QDIA notice and an automatic contribution notice, an annual safe harbor notice. Maybe we talk about the notice on rollover along with the 402F notice. So we think about this in the space of trying to make sure that we have these notices in a spot, in a space that is less paper. What's that get back to? That gets back to that spot that we were talking about before of maybe it ends up being that we're going to end up complying with the one-time annual paper notice requirement by just ignoring the reality that we're going to end up having an electronic disclosure that we're going to mail it in paper, and we're going to mail some other stuff. And we're going to put them all on as little bit of paper as we can, and we're going to put all this stuff together into U-in-1 mailing. That may very well be how the regulations end up, how the marketplace ends up shaking out. It may not. But we realized we do have this charge from Congress to Labor and the Treasury to say, try to figure out how to make this stuff less voluminous, try to figure out how to push it together. Those regulations must be issued no later than December 29, 2024. And then on the next sort of combine the review and report, Congress has actually told Labor, Treasury, and the PBGC to consult with each other. And after consulting with both each other and participant groups and employer groups, they want some reports on the effectiveness of the applicable reporting and disclosure requirements. And they want recommendations to consolidate, simplify, standardize, and improve reporting. So they're really telling these regulators, goodness, guys, we told you to write regs to make this easier and shorter. We need you to come back to us with what legislative changes you need to make this easier and shorter, which is interesting because we're getting right back at that beginning, that first slide. If they're supposed to go, if those regulators are supposed to go to participant and employer groups, and the participants and the employers and the employer groups don't agree, I don't envy the task of Labor, Treasury, and the PBGC of trying to coalesce around the lobbying world that could not otherwise be coalesced, that led us to a space of already having the miscommunications pertaining to whether or not we are allowed to postcard or not postcard certain notices. I hope the answer is a uniform standard. I hope the answer is a uniform standard that allows us to lean into the world in which we live on mobile devices. But we don't know where that reality of the guidance will end up coming out. If I were to be a soothsayer, my guess it's going to look an awful lot like what the guidance was, the Secure 2.0. That Secure 2.0 really ended up driving at anyway. And so then the other one is Secure 2.0, Section 336. The General Accountability Office is directed, and this is interesting that it went to the GAO and not to an appointed position of Labor, Treasury, or the PBGC. The effectiveness of the 402F distribution notice. Again, we talked about the 402F distribution notice. That's the notice that basically tells people, try to keep your money inside of qualified retirement spaces. Try to keep it in a tax-preferred space. And if you don't keep it in a tax-preferred space, you're going to end up having penalties and taxes. So the GAO taking a look at that, trying to figure out how does that get communicated easier, better, smarter. I don't think you can do that work with respect to the 402F notice without also taking on the task that Treasury has of actually writing, I want to say rewriting, but first writing the distribution note, model distribution notice. And then with respect to the charge of combining all of those. So I think that GAO is inevitably going to end up in a dance and a conversation with Treasury pertaining to what is going to be necessary to be able to, for Treasury to issue guidance pertaining to those model election notices. So we went a little bit longer than we actually anticipated today. I thought we'd be done in about 45 minutes, but that was really what we see as the paper, non-paper electronic world of Secure 2.0 and the landscape that otherwise drives us there. Michael, is anything else come in on a question basis that we can address?
Yeah, so this is a clarification question that goes back to earlier, and it says they thought they heard you say that a newly eligible employee has to be mailed an SPD. Is that correct?
No, a newly eligible, so the newly eligible employee, and what we go back to, that to be an unenrolled participant, you have to have received been provided the plan summary, plan description, and other notices, other required notices in connection with initial eligibility. That does not mean that it needs to be mailed. You still have the ability to be able to communicate that SPD and those other notices underneath the modified, the modified Department of Labor regulations pertaining to electronic communications. So it does not need to be mailed. The only thing that we end up with respect to paper, and I realize mailing is not necessarily, you can hand it out in person, is that one-time annual notice for defined contribution plans, and every triannual. So yes, it is triannual. Noted, I think it's triannual notice with respect to defined benefit plans of of account statements. That's the one that has the special rule that probably ends up being paper in hands, unless you have an affirmative election of a participant signed, we think, in paper, that they don't want to receive it in paper, they want to receive it electronically.
Okay, and then I'm inferring from this question that the submitter really wants to give their 2 cents on this topic. So they wanted to know, like, what kind of constitutes participant and employer groups, and is there a way to kind of make sure you can do that?
Oh, this is with respect to 319, I assume, after consultation with participant and employer groups. Yeah. I think that's employer groups, I think, is an aim at trade associations. I think that really gets to we're going to call it the divergence of opinion between some of the employer-facing employer-facing trade associations, American Benefits Council, the ERISA Industry Council, and a few others, versus some of the participant right or aging participants worlds of AARP and the Pension Rights Center, is what I believe that those are aimed at. I would hope that consultation is not just with participants and employer groups, but also actually with employers, not just with the community of retirement benefits, but also directly with large and small employers.
And then this goes back to the unenrolled participant notice, and sort of serves as a good review. Can you give examples of the notices that you would no longer be required to mail if you do use the unenrolled participant notice?
Well, what's interesting about it is you're not necessarily required to mail, but I think that one of them ends up being you don't have to provide a participant statement on paper every year to that individual. So let's go to that required notice that's going to be in 2026 and above. That individual would not have the requirement to get that paper notice, but they're also not going to have a requirement to get an SPD when it's updated every 5 years, to get an SMM if there are any material modifications, to get QDIA notices with respect to the investments. And those are the type of notices that we're seeing would fall away with respect to those unenrolled participants. Since a lot of those, minus the one paper one we've talked about and how that shakes out, are able to be provided electronically anyway, I'm just not positive that this unenrolled participant world is going to end up being worthwhile to segregate populations of enrolled versus unenrolled unless I can save money somehow by winnowing that unenrolled participant crowd away from a source in which I have to pay a per participant per month or per participant per year charge for them.
Okay, and then given time, I'll start to do our wrap up, but I'd like to give a plug for our session next month. It's called the Retirement Emergency Savings Hybrid, and you might wonder, like, well, what is that? And this goes back to, we've talked about some of the policy reasons for Secure 2.0, and one of them is to increase Americans' retirement savings. And what people have found is that a lot of times employees won't participate in the plan because they don't like the thought of their money being locked up in the 401k, and they need some sort of emergency cash savings. So there are multiple Secure 2.0 provisions that are trying to accommodate that and increase different reasons when someone sort of might have an emergency and need the money. It's sort of Congress making public policy of what would be a good reason that would be worthy of that. And then also sort of this concept of, it's called like a sidecar account or a sub account that's specifically for emergency savings. So these are some fairly novel ideas, and I think that next month's session, could be very illuminating as you sort of think about all these provisions and when they go into effect and whether it would be right for your plan. So that's the plug for next month. You will get a copy of this presentation and a recording of it, and that can take up to 2 business days for us to turn it around, but please be patient and you'll get that. If you had any unanswered questions from today, feel free to reach out to your relationship partner or David or me, and we'll be happy to help you. And with that, I will let you go. Thank you again for joining us, and me and David, and we appreciate your attention. Thanks.
Thanks so much, everybody.